from the Gospel of Mark. I'm going to read just a couple of verses. It's a familiar story to you, you know, the story of the temptations. Well, in Matthew and Luke, those are pretty long stories. They go through 3 temptations, and, you know, it's a fairly long story. It's trying to make a couple of points. But in Mark, it's a little different. It's just a couple of verses, and the tenor of it is different. It's not so much a challenge that Jesus is receiving, meaning he's got to, rise to the occasion, or he'll, be thought as unworthy.
Yeah.
Instead, this is a kind of test instead of a temptation. There's a subtle difference there. Right? You can be tested without being tempted, and a testing helps to form us. In any case, to sort of get towards the point I'd like to get, I'm going to read you my translation of the verse. Straight away, the Spirit drove Jesus out into the wilderness, and there he remained for 40 days, tested by the adversary. He was among the wild beasts, but the angels served him. The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever. Went to a 50th anniversary party last night for some dear friends who, in the wine country, they own a winery up there, and Barbara and I were particularly glad to go because it's our anniversary today, and we thanked them for throwing a party for us. It was quite a shindig. Band, dance floor, the whole thing. But I was in a conversation with somebody, and they said, I can't understand why we bother to read the Bible. Right? I always appreciate it when somebody's honest like that, because a lot of people think, why should we bother to read the Bible? But they're not going to tell the pastor that. All right? So it was a healthy conversation. It was good. And there are lots of reasons, of course, to read it once. Okay? I mean, it's, foundation of Western culture. I mean, there are things we learn from it. In order to be a literate human being, you really ought to read the Bible once, or at least the good parts. The begats, maybe not all that important. But there's really one reason that we read the Bible. It's because it's our story. We read it over and over again because it's our story. We don't read it because we want to find out how incredibly powerful or cool Moses was, or Abraham. In fact, most modern-day scholars will tell you that those human beings probably never existed. They're fables. Maybe there's some, back in the far reaches of history, there was an individual by those names, but there are stories that grow up around them. So most scholars would say that until you get to David. David, we know, was an historical figure. They do wonder about Joshua, for instance, and many of the judges. But we read those stories because they're our stories. We read about Elijah because what Elijah went through has something to do with our story and the way we live. We also read the stories about Jesus for the same reason. There's what's called a high Christology and a low Christology when you look at Jesus and you ask, well, who's Jesus? What's he like? Okay. A high Christology means you think of him as, God, the second person of the Trinity. Jesus is this incredible, powerful being, all right? Nothing like us. Right? And a low Christology would be, Jesus is just another guy, and we have some stories about him. I tend to the low Christology side of theology, which is not to say I don't believe in the Trinity. I do, but I'm concerned when we put Jesus too high up on a pedestal. Because if we do, then we read the stories about Jesus and we say, well, he's God. He can do that, but we can't. And the whole point of this Gospel of Mark is to challenge people to indeed express the love of God exactly the way Jesus had. When he said, take up your cross and follow me in the 8th chapter of the Gospel of Mark, he meant it. serve in the ways that challenge the destructive authorities. That's what he was interested in. It's important for us to recognize that because his story is our story of a life of faith. And when we read his story, we're reading about what a human being looks like when they live out the love of God in a particular society at a particular time perfectly. That's the story we're reading. That's who Jesus is. It's good for us to know Jesus' story because I don't know about you, but there are times when I feel like the Spirit has driven me into the wilderness. Really do. Feel like you're driven into the wilderness. Now, I have to say that I don't think there's a spirit out there that drives us into suffering and barrenness and death. That's not what I think happens, but wow, does it feel like that? You can understand why they'd say it. You look over your shoulder at your life and you realize there have been moments when you feel like you've been led into a time of struggle and suffering that you'd have to call wilderness. It certainly feels that way. Maybe you feel that way now. I don't know. We go through periods. We all do. Sometimes we go through periods of deep grief. That's a time of wilderness. One of Barbara's closest friends has entered hospice about a week ago. And wow, she just seemed to go downhill so fast. She was supposed to go to the party last night, but didn't have the energy. We just had lunch 2 weeks ago. And her wife is just in a period of wilderness, trying to figure out what comes next. Kind of lost, sometimes lonely and afraid. That's what wilderness feels like. It's awfully easy to be isolated. I was talking to somebody from this church this week who's working with somebody close to him who's lost her husband. And she has this deep anger towards God about it.
So they are
Isolated
having
herself.
friends over and they're playing
That's
Monopoly.
what it's like to live in the wilderness. We feel lost and far away from God. We feel like we're walking in wilderness times when we're
Emma's Anna's partner, and they have
support
couple coming.
someone who is sick or who has various challenges over the long haul. Trying to stand with somebody who suffers from mental illness. Stand with somebody who has a long-term illness of any kind. Trying to support them. It's a long period of wilderness time, and it's a struggle for us. But wilderness times are not just personal. Some wilderness times happen to groups of people, like the Christian church over the last 50 years, for instance. You know, we exist in a world that really doesn't have a lot of use for us anymore. Christian faith used to be at the center of U.S. culture. It's really moved out to the peripheries in most areas of the country. Now, there are some where it does remain. It's a time of wilderness.
Now he
What's
said, she
happening?
said, if you guys go bowling, will the girls
What
be
will
back at
become of
2
us
to eat?
might be the question. I think, too, about the entire society.
Yeah.
And that's when I begin to relate at a time of wilderness. As we're staring into this void of a future that just feels like enormous change, just piles on top of change and piles on top of change, and we hardly get our bearings when it changes again. When I was raising my kids, one of the big things we had to figure out is what on earth to do about video games. How many should we let them play? Which one should we let them play? When should we let them play? That was our big thing. Right? And I used to say to Barbara or Debbie when they were younger, I would say, Matthew's going to know how to handle this when he has a kid. He grew up with them, right? So when he gets to be a parent and he understands how things fit together, he'll know. He'll know. The trouble is he didn't grow up in the era of social media. Things have changed too fast. So now he's going to have to figure out what to do with that when it's not really in his bones. But little kids today, growing up in a world of social media, as dangerous and difficult as it is, I have a feeling they'll know what to do. But by then, AI will have completely enveloped our world because things are moving too fast. Talking to an attorney last night who said that when he was young, he's 88 now, said when he was young, first 3 years out of law school, what you did is you summarized depositions. You just sat there and summarized them. Says now AI just does that job, at the click of a button, and frankly does a better job. So attorneys' jobs are disappearing. Many doctors are worried about what's going to happen. And then there's the impact on trust that has to do with deep fakes. I saw a great picture of Eric Clapton. I don't know if, aside from being an insanely good guitarist, he's a fisherman, loves to fish. And I saw this picture of him with about a 15-pound salmon. And it really looked real until you realized that he didn't have a right hand. And this is when they're crummy. You read about people who believe the fake videos where Biden says the most horrendous stuff to people. And, if you look hard, you can tell they're not real, but the further this goes, the more we're not going to be able to tell, and we're going to be living in a wilderness because there won't be trust, there'll be isolation. I'm hoping it's the thing that drives folks to come back to church ultimately. It's hard for us. But it's for times like this that we read the Bible. Because we know what comes from a time of wilderness. We know it comes from a time of wilderness because for century upon century, people of faith have lived through these times, come out the other side, and told us stories about them. We think that God is far, far away when we're in the wilderness. Not the case. You read the stories about the wilderness and you realize God is quite present. Moses, out in the wilderness, comes across a burning bush. Brings the people out of Egypt, comes again to the wilderness, enters into the cloud where God was fully present, and receives instructions on how to build a new society. Elijah, he runs away and ends up being cared for by the presence of God in the midst of the wilderness. And Jesus, well, turns out the angels served him, the messengers from the Spirit of God. We know that time and time again, though it may feel like we are isolated and alone in the midst of wilderness, we are not. The presence of the Spirit of God is living right there with us, going through it with us. Also in the wilderness, we know that we are forced to rely on the presence of God. When I think about our society today, it seems pretty clear that a society that's turned its back on discussions of God and God's power and God's desires and God's strength, that society is going to have to turn and rely on the God of all creation. It's what happens in the wilderness. We know it because we read the book. That's why you read it over and over and over again. You also, in the wilderness, develop a vision, clarity for the future. Moses, when he came down from that mountain in the wilderness, his face all aglow with the 10 Commandments. That's a vision for what a human society can look like when it centers its life on the love of God. A clear vision that came out of that wilderness time. And for Jesus, the very next thing he does after the angels have served him is goes out into Galilee and says, the kingdom of God is at hand, a clarified vision. Time and time again, it's how it works. It's why I am hopeful. Even though I've considered the facts, I'm hopeful. Because it's God's way, and people of faith have for centuries been saying so. It's God's way to care for us in the wilderness. It's God's way to serve us in the wilderness. It's God's way to clarify our vision in the wilderness. And though I can't imagine how this society is going to navigate the enormous changes that are facing us year after year, decade after decade, I am certain we will. Because the presence of God does not let us down in the wilderness. The dynamic exists. This week, a group of us talked to someone, talked about 400 homeless families that walked through the wilderness and came out the other side. A group called Family Promise. We spoke to this woman, Marcia, the director, because we were hoping maybe she could be a partner with us. I'm pretty sure every one of us wanted her to be our partner at the end of it, but her organization is in Sacramento, just a little too far away. But she's taken over the last 20 years 400 single-parent families, most of whom became single-parent homeless families because of domestic abuse, and taken them from their cars and put them in transitional housing and allowed for a more permanent life. We were stunned to learn that almost 10% of those families have purchased a home through the wilderness with a clarified vision. The dynamic exists. Our God seeks to bring people into greater hope and fruition. It's how it operates. What about you? I don't know whether you're in a time of deep grief, scared about illness, or whether you are caring for somebody where the caring for them goes on and on and on. But our book says that you can trust that the presence of God is with you and that the vision for the future will clarify. That as you turn your hearts toward the presence of God, it's not that it gets easier, it's that it gets more purposeful and whole. That was certainly my experience with my first wife, who was sick for the entire 10 years of our marriage. Well, we had 6 months off here and 6 months off there. But the presence of God was with me, and there was a clarified vision for me of how I wanted to raise the boys as her life came to an end. And I know that the presence of God brought Barbara to me, the perfect mother for my son, Matthew. It's the nature of things. It's the way God's work. I wonder if you have stories like that. I'm sure you do if you look over your shoulder at your own history. That when you've been through that wilderness time, that lonely time, that scary time where it feels like there are dangers looking to tear down your life. And then you come to the other side. I mean, if you look over your shoulder at your history, you can see how God has called you forward towards a greater whole, a more perfect harmony. And if you have those stories and you see someone walking through the wilderness, you can sit by that person, listen to them, let them scream at God, but you can have a quiet confidence that you know at the end it will unfold and God's presence will be there, offering support and a clarified vision for what comes next. It's the way God works. In the end, the angels minister to us. And it's not about Jesus. It's about you. And it's about me. That's why we read it. The entire book is our story. Because people of faith for thousands of years have been discerning exactly what God was doing and wanted us to know about it. That's why I read the book. Whatever burden weighs you down, whatever flaw, whatever trauma you've experienced or dream that's been left unfulfilled in your life, know this. You are an expression of the creative love and power of God. You cannot be separated from God's love. God seeks your perfection and not your destruction.